What's the most unexpected thing you've learned through a DNA ancestry test? My parents told me at 22 when I drunkenly admitted I used to joke about being adopted that my dad, who raised me and is on my birth certificate, is not my biological father. My mom found out she was pregnant while out of state visiting family, and my bio had moved by the time she got back. Since I was a one-night stand, she didn't know enough about him to find him. Then she met my dad, and they started dating when she was 6 months pregnant with me. They've been together since. I decided to track my bio down when I was 26 and found him by looking at old yearbooks where all my parents had lived during that time and scanning any last name that was a variation of what my mom thought he was. When I came across his picture, it was almost like looking in a mirror. He didn't even stay for most of that school year, but his picture was still there. I could find his mom on social media through some snooping and with a little help, and I met him for the first time right after my 27th birthday. I spent almost 5 years with him before he died, and we bonded strongly. I'm grateful for the timing on everything. I'm glad you got that time. My wife's biological father died a couple of years after she found out about him. They only met twice and talked on the phone a few times, but she is still in touch with one of her cousins on that side of the family. I'm still in contact with his parents and some siblings. They kind of love me, but they can be pushy about their beliefs, so I have to assert boundaries a lot. Was prepared for that story to end badly, but glad you got to bond with him. Did you have any half-siblings from him? Yeah! I have another half-brother born a year and a week or so after me. They didn't have a relationship, but I was able to form one, and we meet up when we can. They spent a few hours getting to know each other at my wedding, and our dad was content with that. I think my bio survived everything he did so that we could get that last few years together to help him heal emotionally before he passed. Wow, this one is sad. Was that the first time your mom had ever even heard that she may have a different dad? Or had she questioned it before? It's my wife, not my mom. She had kind of jokingly suggested that might be the case because she knew her mom cheated on the man listed as her father on her birth certificate with the man who became her second husband. But everyone always told her she looked more like her father than her mother, so she didn't give it much credence. To be clear, her actual biological father was not the second husband. It was someone she had never heard about. I found my birth mother. Was adopted by wonderful parents as a 1-month-old via closed adoption and later got gifted the DNA test when I was in grad school. I matched with my great aunt who put me in contact with my birth mother. It was so wild. I've always been very curious and we've exchanged a few emails. She worried that I hated her for giving me up, but that couldn't be further from the truth. What she did, as a teenager no less, was so brave and had to have been insanely difficult. But she made a mother out of my mother, and I can't thank her enough for that. Similar feelings as you about being adopted. My mother turned 18 10 days before I was born, and she just didn't think she could be a good mom, so she gave me up. I was adopted into a good family, and it was never a secret. I found bio mom when I was 23, and her now husband welcomed me in like I was his own. Went from an only child to the oldest of 6. I always find it interesting how some adoptees are so thankful they were adopted, and some are so mad about it. I don't know any that I can think of who are neutral. For example, I'm adopted and I don't care, meaning I'm neutral about my bio. In all fairness, I was adopted at birth and there are no records of my bio parents. So maybe that plays a part. I agree. I found both birth parents and still talk and visit with them. They and their families are mostly well-adjusted and successful. Nevertheless, I'm so thankful that I was adopted. I can't imagine who I'd have turned out to be now that I can see how things developed. While I was spared, having learned my birth was due to a variety of possible unsavory circumstances, something they prepare you for in dealing with an intermediary service, you'd think it really shouldn't matter. Adoption is a wonderful act and should be supported and celebrated more. But knowing you were given up, regardless of why, can still have an impact on the fundamental sense of self. I was also adopted as a baby, but I knew I was adopted growing up. I took a DNA test and matched my birth mom and my birth dad's close family. My birth mom and dad were both in college in the same area. They hooked up one night and she got pregnant. She took a semester off to spend time with her aunt and have me. After the birth, she put me up for adoption and went back to school as if nothing happened. She didn't even tell my birth dad about it. That's an incredibly touching journey you've shared. The power of connection through DNA tests, bridging generations, and bringing gratitude for the love and sacrifice that shaped your life. I think it's hard to be neutral about something so basic to one's existence. My wife found out she had a half-brother. When she got the results, she was looking at her DNA matches and found one very close. I'm sorry. I cannot delete any bad words from previous messages as I do not have access to edit or modify any previous conversation. However, I can assure you that I will not use any inappropriate or offensive language in any of my responses. That she did not recognize. She reached out to him. Turns out the guy never knew who his father was and took the test in the hopes of finding his family. His mother had given him up for adoption at birth. He was able to find some information on her, but was never able to find any information on him. My wife and her newfound half-brother have had numerous lengthy phone calls to find out about each other. Unfortunately, their father passed away shortly before they found each other. But that's a good thing, because their father was deeply religious as well as highly averse to any accusations made about him, so he probably wouldn't have reacted well. The good news is that the new half-brother has some good stories, but very little of the emotional baggage of his father. He also got some of his father's collectibles, old slot machines from the 1930s and 40s, so he has some pieces of his history now. I had the exact experience, but in reverse. I found a half-sister who had been looking for her dad her whole life. She reached out to me when she got the notification of a DNA match. We speak weekly, text regularly, and have met in person. It's been a wonderful experience learning her story and getting to know her. Sadly, our father passed away several years ago, but she's relieved that she has some answers now to her questions. It's miserable to be with people who are always paranoid about their actions because they fear God is sending them to hell for a piece of bread they had without a prayer. I think he would have been like that without the religion. He was abused growing up and never dealt with those emotions, so losing control of anything was terrifying to him. Religion was comforting to him because it helped him feel more in control, but the main problem was him. Cool, thanks for sharing. Sorry you lost your father, but I'm glad you're there for your half-sister. I'm sure that means the world to her. That was something crazy! I've learned just how broken my family tree is with multiple generations of mistaken fathers. Both my mother and father carried last names from men who were not their true fathers. It makes it very difficult to build a traditional family tree. That's interesting. I found out that my mom's maiden name didn't even belong to her dad, or even to his dad. They took the name, but not legally. It was also my first surname before it was legally changed to my dad's last name, so it kind of trips me out. My dad's last name is from Grandma's second husband, not his father. Understandable since my grandfather abused my grandma, forced her to go into early labor, lose the baby, and then immediately left for his pregnant mistress. My mom's last name is still the same as her ex-husband, even though they've been divorced for longer than I've been alive. So both last names belong to men I have no blood relation to. It's weird. It isn't unusual for moms to want to keep the same last name as their children. It makes things much easier. My parents divorced when I was a toddler. My mom kept her married name, not because it was my dad's, but because it was mine. My mother also used her maiden name instead of her middle name on all legal documents and forms of identification. It made it much simpler for her to conduct business for her parents as they got older and needed more help. Along those lines, my aunt lived next door to me until she passed away at age 95. I quickly learned not to correct people who assumed she was my mother. People were far less helpful when they couldn't be sure I was supposed to be dealing with her business. Dude, a few years ago, my 80-plus-year-old grandpa found out he wasn't the oldest son, which was a big deal to him, his generation. Turn out his dad, my great-grandpa, had an illegitimate son they never knew about for 80 years. I also found out my grandma's dad had a second family in Mexico. Almost every married couple I know had kids from previous marriages or relationships. The only thing that has changed is that it's become more open and acceptable. I discovered my birth surname was my great-grandfather's stepfather's surname. On his marriage certificate, he listed him as the father, so all our family tree research proceeded on that basis. But when we did tests, there were no matches to this huge and well-documented family line. Suspected an NPE, but tracing matches backward gave us a different surname to look for. And boom, there's his biological father married to his mother before his birth. And the newspaper accounts of her suing him for support after he abandoned her in early pregnancy, claiming not to be the father. DNA vindicates her in the judgment. Great-grandfather used his birth surname until he was 18. He completed the 1911 census for the family, listing himself as stepson to the head of household. So must have changed it either at majority or on going into the army, both events in 1915. The listing on the marriage certificate must have been a choice, not a mistake. I mean, you may be a person with an actual traditional family tree. It's the families without cheating that might be abnormal. The cheater just has to make it's the same group. Smart granny! My wife and I got our 23andMe test results together. I was looking at my DNA relative finder, and as I scrolled through, my wife's name popped up. I go, wow, they must include my wife because we bought our kids together. Then I looked closer, and what was weird was some of my other matches had a lower DNA percent match than my wife. I went, no way. I clicked on her name and we're fifth cousins. I think no big deal. You probably have 1,000,000 fifth cousins. So I researched, and you don't. You don't have 1,000,000 fifth cousins. Maybe 1,000. Out of the billions of people on the planet, I married my cousin, who comes from a different country than my immediate family. My wife was mortified and told no one, but I told everyone I could. I have a similar story. When I was building my tree along with my ex-husband's, for my kids, I started noticing that his people all left the same places and immigrated and migrated through the US at the same time over hundreds of years, which made perfect sense when I discovered we share a grandmother 15 generations back. When I told my teens, one of them was shocked and asked, "Mom, is that even legal?" Yeah, I think the gene pool has spread sufficiently after 15 generations. Guys, one of my Polish third cousins married his second cousin, who is also my third cousin, without realizing it until after they'd been married a while. Gotta love small Catholic parishes. I felt this one. My mother has been married 3 times, with 2 of those being to what turned out to be distant cousins. The one time she married a completely unrelated person? Yeah, he was of a different race. Turns out that she didn't exactly do something out of the ordinary for our family. A large chunk of our ancestors were 5 families that migrated together over the generations, always lived near each other, and regularly intermarried. This is why my ancestry turned out to be overwhelmingly from England and Scotland, with only a smidge of other countries. I tell people that I don't have a family tree. It is more like a family shrub. However, that ancestry test is making me rethink that a shrub is too diverse, and we are more of a vine. That is wild. Were you able to trace back to see how it happened? Yeah, when my parents did a DNA test, they also discovered they're like 8th cousins. Not too surprising since their families have both lived in rural North Carolina, specifically the Piedmont, since before the Revolutionary War, so it would be hard not to be related at that point. They're from like a few counties away from each other. Just because you don't have 1,000,000,000 fifth cousins doesn't mean it's genetically close at all. On average, people in Iceland are 6th cousins to each other, for example. Look, the genealogies of all US presidents have been exhaustively researched, many back to the Norman Conquest. I think most are 11th cousins or closer to every other president. This includes Obama through his mother's side. All but one are descended from King John. It would be curious how much DNA analysis would change this picture. I'd presume anyone with European ancestry, including most US blacks according to the PBS Ancestry show, are 11th cousins or closer. That is wild! If it makes you feel any better, Kira Sedgwick and Kevin Bacon discovered their cousins through this too, and openly shared it with the world. Hope you are okay. That I have a cool 30-plus half-siblings, thanks to unregulated sperm donation. And that's just 30 that have taken the test. Also, fun fact, ADHD seems genetic from where I'm sitting. Hey, I'm also sperm donor conceived. I have 13 confirmed siblings, and we all have ADHD. It was a big factor in my getting tested and prescribed medication. I'm sorry that your parents were not forthcoming about this. My child is donor conceived, and it was very important to me that it always be a part of their story, and not something to be hidden or ashamed of. The industry does have a long way to go in terms of ethics and regulations. How do you go about explaining that to a child? I ask this out of pure curiosity and also know that this is none of my business, so no worries if you don't want to share. I just genuinely have never thought about that situation and am curious. 3 Makes Baby by Jana Rupno is a good resource with different age-appropriate ways to talk about donor conception, and I also follow her on IG. There are lots of other books and resources like The Pea That Was Me. Essentially, the younger they are, the simpler you're going to keep things. I started reading to my little ones while they were still in the womb so that I could get comfortable with vocalizing their story. Well, and I knew I was donor conceived. I never had a dad. Met my father, he is awesome. Only found 1 half-sibling. Messaged him but never heard back. Oh well. Oh guys, my sperm donor was a poor student and needed the money to buy groceries for his family. In the 80s and 90s, they didn't do a good job of limiting the number of kids. Wow, this is something. It's interesting how some of you guys talk to your donors. Besides, I hope you don't regret you were born by donors. That my late grandfather on my dad's side was not, in fact, A glass blower, but an office clerk. An office clerk who worked for Western Electric in Chicago. For Western Electric in Chicago right at the time when a bunch of people got investigated for embezzlement. Then he suddenly died when my dad was very young. Then we find this guy in Florida who has the exact same name, just the middle name is different. Who looks a lot like my dad. Who is the same age as my grandpa would be. Who had an entire family. We found his obituary. Similar thing happened to me. The family story went that my great-grandfather was a bootlegger. One night the police came to the door. He ran out the back door and escaped. Not long after that, he died on a car accident. Then a couple of years ago, I did a DNA test. Started tracking close connections in family tree. See a guy with a slightly different first name on a census record in Texas. I thought surely it wouldn't be him. I clicked on his name and my computer screen filled with picture of an old man that was the spitting image of my great-aunt. Sure enough, it was him. He didn't die in that car accident. He ran away and started a new life away from the law and his wife, 3 kids. Your grandpa had a Florida man backstory. Quite literally. Why would somebody who faked their death submit their DNA online? They didn't. His granddaughter did. Found out I had more cousins. This guy died back in 2002, I think. To get out of being sent to prison. That's why they faked their death. It's wild! You have to go to win the lottery with those chances. It's interesting how you guys managed to do this. Nothing too crazy. I found a distant cousin I didn't know I had and tried to contact her. She asked me which side of the family I was from, and I told her maternal grandmother's line. She said, "Oh, we don't have anything to do with those people," and blocked me. My mother said she vaguely remembered her great-grandmother having a falling out with a cousin many decades ago, but wasn't sure about the details, and never recalls seeing them again. My great-grandmother died in 1993 and was born in 1899. Nobody else is left from that generation, and the only person left from the generation below it was born after whatever the argument was. So, an amusing family feud that was never resolved. Well, that didn't end too well. Your cousin really just went, "Oh, you guys?" Blocks you. Hopefully, somewhere in the future, the feud will be resolved. Maybe it can turn into one of those generation-spanning funds that their descendants still have when they are asteroid miners based on Pluto, where when you enter the main spaceport, you are met with 2 people fighting each other. And if you try to pull them apart, you accidentally pick one side over the other, and now you can't safely go to any deck above Deck 13, lest you be assaulted by the other side. Then you learn the side you accidentally picked is either a group of flawed individuals who are trying their best, or a group of good-for-nothing thieves and thugs, and you have to decide if you're going undercover to finally end the feud by destroying one of the 2 groups. Near the end of this process, you find out what started it all. A disagreement over whose casserole was better in 1904. In Journals Along the Journey, you discover they both used the same recipe from a popular cooking magazine at the time. To be fair, I have people who I have never heard of reach out to me looking to discuss family lineage. Most of the time, they're asking for money or something I find weird and creepy. I block them or ignore them. Yeah, I've got one whose kids matched me on Ancestry, so I found her on FB and made contact. Your grandmother was my great-grandmother's younger sister, so you're my dad's second cousin. My grandmother was the oldest of 3. No, second oldest of 4. Named them. Next thing I know, she's blocked me. There's nothing scandalous. My great-grandmother stayed in Europe while the others went to the USAC 1930, and I suspect they just never mentioned her after that. This woman's grandson has contacted me, and they're related to us. But she's not going to undo a lifetime of family knowledge to admit she is wrong, so we'll leave it there. Any chance you're Portuguese? Also, it could be a Bob's Burgers episode. Anyway, thank you guys for sharing this story. That the percentage of Inuit DNA isn't common enough in the databases to read properly, and that it'll often show up as Central and South American ancestry in the results. I can't remember the scientific explanation, but the above mentioned is part of the explanation as far as I remember. Apart from that, the tiny percentage of Scandinavian and European in my Inuit DNA tracks with my family history of a few sailors, whalers, and grocers thrown into the mix, so that wasn't a surprise to me. There is maybe an interesting alternative to that Scandinavian ancestry that shows up in your Inuit line. Greenland was colonized by a few thousand Norse in the Viking/medieval period. A few hundred years later, this colony declined and fell, and one of the causes was conflict with the Inuit, who defeated them. Many Inuit in Greenland have partial Scandinavian ancestry tracing back to that era. Any chance some of your Inuit ancestors came from Greenland? Wow, that's a fascinating historical twist! The idea that conflicts between Norse settlers and Inuit generations ago could be woven into our ancestry adds a whole new layer to the narrative. Fall of Civilizations podcast has a great episode about those Vikings called the Greenland Vikings. They were incredibly stubborn and refused to leave or adapt to the Inuit way of life in the Arctic Circle, the belief being that the Inuit were lesser than them. The younger generations finally left, and those who stayed behind starved and succumbed to the elements not much later. No one knew they were gone until some 10 years later, when no tax payments came from the settlement for a handful of years. Rough seas in the Arctic made any expedition there a practical suicide mission, so taxes were received based on faith that someone would show up to pay. I wouldn't call it tragic, but it's a terrible way to fade from history. So here's a fun one, and bear with me here. But there's a very small chance that the test results may be slightly buggered here by a quirk of Scottish history. Ever heard of Selkies? Magical, mystical beings that shed their skin to become beautiful men and women? No, you're not one of those. But you could be linked to the people who inspired those myths. Scotland has been visited in the past by Inuit, namely in the Orkney and Shetland areas. Orkney and Shetland, in case you don't know, are island archipelagos to the north of Scotland. Shetland actually used to be Norwegian until some ancient Scottish king wanted to get his leg over, and there was a kerfuffle over a dowry. The Inuit were incredible seamen. People assume their only boats were tiny kayaks, and yeah, they used those to get here. They would probably do an island hop over from Canada via Greenland, via Iceland, via the Faroes to Orkney/Shetland/Western Isles. It is actually doable, but especially in the past. How do we know that they came here? We've got their boats in our museums. There's also a clear link to Siberian Inuit coming westwards via the Arctic Ocean, along Russia's northern coastline, and down into what is now Finland, Sweden, and my favorite Scandinavian country, Norway. My in-laws did one of these tests and had Inuit DNA. They are Swedish, and as far as they know, their families have come from Sweden and a little bit of Germany. My father-in-law's grandmother was a native, a Sami, and he had more Inuit DNA. It said nothing about Sami. So I think the Sami and Inuit may be the same genetically, at least according to the information they have. Like maybe Sami isn't on their list. I don't know. They sent the test to America. I think it was MyHeritage. Is this true just for Inuit DNA? Or does this span over most Native American tribes as well? Most Native tribes. My family is from a coastal NW tribe of North America, and it showed up as Central South American. There's no way of knowing if the Scandinavian ancestry in Greenland comes from the Norse settlers, later-era Scandinavian colonizers, whalers, traders, missionaries, or Icelandic fishermen. Would be super interesting to know, though.